contemporary world and the American context. First, let me just say it's so great to see you all in person. And I'd love to start by thanking our funders, the Tripp Foundation and the Shapiro Foundation, for making possible the Mali Magic series, which we kicked off last season when we invited and hosted the luminary Dr. Abdelkader Hydra, who rescued 400,000 Malian manuscripts, and without whose life work, none of this would be possible tonight. We'd also like to thank our friends and partners at Google Arts and Culture for their collaboration throughout the series and the support of Dr. Hydra and his organization, Savama. Brooklyn Public Library is proud to be the exclusive US partner with Google for cultural programming around Mali Magic. And as you've likely seen, the library's position on the free circulation of knowledge and ideas couldn't be stronger. So this program is part of that commitment. As you will hear tonight, recentering knowledge away from prevailing Eurocentric narratives is a gift afforded by these Malian manuscripts. And our speakers will immerse us in selected passages and then connect the manuscripts to the American context, discussing the illuminating, daring, and even uncomfortable insights that can be won by working with archives. Our panel tonight, we're welcoming Lama El-Dessouky, Dr. Herbert Brewer, Melisande Short-Colomb, and our moderator, Cynthia Schneider. She is a very close collaborator with us on this series for over 2 years. She is the PhD and distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University, where she teaches, she publishes, and organizes initiatives. Excuse me. More importantly, and forgive me from reading for a page, she co-directs the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics at Georgetown and the Los Angeles-based MOST resource, which stands for Muslims on Screen and Television. She also co-directs the Mali-based Timbuktu Renaissance. She speaks and publishes on topics related to art, culture, media, international affairs. She was a member of the art history faculty at Georgetown from 1984 to 2005, and from 1998 to 2001, she served as a US ambassador to the Netherlands. So we are just, again, immeasurably and immensely pleased to have our friends here tonight guiding us through this rich material. Thank you, and Cynthia, I leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Cora. Thank you so much. Come on, guys, let's go. So thank you so much for coming tonight. We're going to take a journey together, a journey into the past, actually a couple of different pasts that both illuminate and shake up the present. And our first stop on this trip is going to be Timbuktu in Western Africa in Mali. Timbuktu, as you may know, was an extraordinary hub of commerce, culture, scholarship, really on a par with and in the same time as Renaissance Florence. I'm going to let a well-known West African proverb describe it to you. And the proverb goes, "Salt comes from the north, gold from the south, and silver from the country of the white men. But the word of God and the treasures of wisdom are only to be found in Timbuktu." Now, I'm sorry to tell you we're not actually all going to go to Timbuktu, which is so bad because it's a beautiful place, but we are going to be able to travel there through the extraordinary web platform Mali Magic, and we'll be exploring that together tonight, and I hope you all will really spend time with it afterwards. Mali Magic was born 7 years ago when a project manager at Google Arts and Culture, which I really commend to you to explore this site. Project manager at Google Arts and Culture brought tears to the eyes of Mali's then president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, by projecting an image from the Mali manuscripts next to an image of a manuscript from Leonardo da Vinci. And he spoke, and we understood the commonalities, same time period, similar humanistic and scientific ideas. And that took place at a meeting, the U.S. Islamic World Forum, convened by the Brookings Institution, held in Doha, Qatar. I had, for several years, convened groups of arts and cultural leaders at that meeting. And for this one, we had the arts and culture leaders of Mali, including Dr. Abdulkader Haidara, meeting with American counterparts to strategize how arts and culture in Mali could be leveraged to support the country's recovery from conflict. Out of that meeting came the Timbuktu Renaissance, which I co-direct with Malian colleagues, and a serious interest from Google Arts and Culture in developing a web platform about Mali. We converted that interest into commitment when I persuaded the head of Google Arts and Culture, Amit Sood, to come with us 2 weeks later. I'd actually never met him, but fortunately he was a big fan of Malian music, so I got a hold of him and said, come to Timbuktu with us in 2 weeks. And he said, sure. And so that trip cemented the commitment of Google Arts and Culture to build this web platform. And I have to honestly tell you, it is a real commitment. They worked on it for 7 years, and it's their biggest project they've ever done. Can we have, yeah, great. But the critical partner in all of this was, of course, this man, Dr. Abdulkader Haidara, otherwise known as the head of the badass librarians of Timbuktu. And he earned that name for his phenomenal rescue of, I'm sorry, Cora, I think it's over 300,000, but anyway, a whole lot of manuscripts from Timbuktu when the city in 2012 was occupied by Al-Qaeda-linked extremists. And Dr. Haidara was just walking down the street just a couple days after they had invaded and taken over the city, and he saw all these papers from the town hall like flying in the air. And he then had spent his whole life in manuscripts and was a great curator and scholar of manuscripts. And he thought, oh my God, that could happen to the manuscripts. What if they find them? So he developed a scheme with just about 5 or 6 close friends to take the manuscripts out bit by bit, like, a few dozen every night, in these kind of schlocky suitcases, very ordinary suitcases. They took them on donkey carts, in cars, on boats, always in such a way to escape notice. And they got over 300,000 manuscripts unscathed to the capital, Bamako. Can we have the next slide, please, Lama? And there, in Bamako, Dr. Haidara established a storage place for the manuscripts. He actually hid them all over the city in different places and began an operation, and this is sort of stage 2 of his work on the manuscripts, began an operation to digitize them, to catalog them, and to preserve those that were damaged. And ironically, he was able to do this digitization because of the invasion by the extremists. He'd been asking the families who own the manuscripts, and that is how they're mostly owned, in families, for years if they'd be willing to digitize them, and they'd always said no. But then once they saw that they really could have been destroyed, then they agreed. So here you see Dr. Haidara in his facility of Savama, his NGO, in Bamako. Now he is on, and we'll talk about this in more detail later on, now he's on the third phase of his work with the manuscripts, and that is to make their content accessible widely within Mali and around the world. So I think it's very appropriate that we are talking about this badass librarian in the Brooklyn Public Library, which, as we know, and Cora alluded to, is staffed by a lot of badass librarians. So, you know, if you ban a book, they're going to just make sure that book gets out. And, you know, we know knowledge, people are always trying to suppress knowledge, and that is certainly what has happened to the knowledge contained in the Mali manuscripts. It was, you know, for years, and it still exists, but you all are going to go out and make sure you do your best to destroy this myth. There has been this myth that Africa has no written history. Now, why would that be when there are hundreds and thousands, you know, millions at one time of manuscripts? Well, this myth was, of course, perpetuated by the European colonialists, because it's much easier to plunder all of the natural resources and to enslave people if you can dehumanize them and strip them of their knowledge and identity. And that's what has happened. It was a key component of the practice of slavery. And that takes me now to the second half of our program, where we will be talking about other dangerous archives, archives with uncomfortable truths, and those are American archives. We're going to particularly look at the slavery archives of Georgetown University, which is a fascinating case study in the revealing of truths that have been hiding in plain sight and now are out, just as we have with Mali Magic and the knowledge of Mali. So to give you a sense of how we are going to do this, I want to introduce the panelists who are joining me here. First, Dr. Herbert Brewer, who is an assistant professor of history and geography at Morgan State University. And I have to tell you, I'm not a CV kind of moderator. So Dr. Brewer has many distinguished publications, and you can find that on his website. But instead, I want to ask you, Dr. Brewer, Herbert, if I can, you are, in a sense, an embodiment of what we're doing tonight, straddling Africa and the United States through the painful history that links our two continents. So tell me, what interested you in studying West Africa and also the slavery documents of the United States?
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm Herbert Brewer, and I teach history. I'm a historian at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Morgan State is Maryland's largest and oldest historically black tertiary institution. I came to history in a whole variety of ways. Personally, I come from a family that is both African and American, as in parents and grandparents and forebears, who literally came from Africa and who came from the United States. So you could say bicultural in a way, growing up having family on both sides of the Atlantic. And I spent some of my formative years in Liberia as well. So around me was all of this culture. And once I got to college, I was interested in, I guess in a way, understanding in a more systematic way that unique or that interesting history. We could talk a little bit later about like there are many complex aspects of that very same family history, in that one of my forebears is actually a descendant, my Liberian forebear, who is a descendant of someone who came from the United States. So it was several,
goes both ways.
Several circles, exactly. So again, as that kind of embodied that transatlantic sort of identity there. and trying to understand, in the case of West Africa, the sort of political turmoil at the time that I was now becoming an adult, the political turmoil that had taken place there. And so history helped to provide an answer. I kind of saw it that way. And
You are in violent agreement with Dr. Hydra
Yeah.
in that statement.
Yes.
He would agree with you also in terms of finding a solution to conflict.
Yes.
So,
And here I find myself today trying to really understand those links and ties, and that inquiry got me to start to discover and understand the significance of the transatlantic system, the transatlantic traffic, slavery, the plantation system, and it's a legacy that we all live with today. One of the things, as we explore this a bit more, is we'll come to understand the extent to which modernity, the modern world, going back 500 years, a central component of it was the institution of slavery. And so that slavery wasn't something that was just ancient, it was very much part of what makes the world what it is today. And we can talk about some of that.
thank you. We will come to that in the second half of our program. And Lama, looming behind us, we are very lucky to be joined by Lama Eldasuki from Google Arts and Culture, who is really kind enough to join us from London. So, it's midnight for her, so she's very dedicated to this project, and we really appreciate it. Lama is a project manager at Google Arts and Culture. And Lama, we're going to talk a little bit later on about your work with the Mali Magic Project, but I would love for you to just talk about, it means people may not be familiar with Google Arts and Culture. What is your work? What's the breadth of your work there? What are some of the things you're working on? What's a typical day? And what led you to want to work there?
I that's a lot to go. No, I'm really happy to join, and I'm caffeinated, so it's good. As you mentioned, I'm joining from London, and that's why I'm a floating head. But I am from Egypt, and that's one of the really big connections I have with this project. My background is actually in product design, and later went to culture preservation. But when I started with product design, I was very interested in solving problems. But then I saw that the world doesn't need more things, it needs to really connect with what already exists. And there's a lot of amazing things out there. And so I started considering and struggling with the idea, how do we access them? How do we let the world know and understand what's out there better and needn't reinvent the wheel every time we want to do something? So that was sort of the origins of preserving what we have and the importance of the cultural connections that we can muster. So my passion in cultural commonalities and humanities sprang from there. After a couple of years also in Afghanistan, where you got to see a lot of the on-ground passion of culture preservation for countries that are losing their history very easily. And that also brings us to the manuscripts in Timbuktu and being remote in a place where a lot of people can't reach, can't access for tourism, and then you want to share that with the world. You want to find another way to reach them and understand and be familiar with such amazing places that we have out there. At Google Arts and Culture, actually, we do a lot. I am part of the preservation team, which is working from preserving cultural heritage through 3D scanning and monitoring the effects of climate change on World Heritage Sites, to using machine learning to decode ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, to using video games for educational content and access to learn about ancient Mesoamerica. So these are some of the examples of the projects we've worked on, and aside also from the amazing Mali Magic. So there's a lot of ways in which we can work and present the world's cultures in most engaging, immersive ways, just only to pay tribute and justice.
Thank you, Lama, very much. I'm going to say I've seen Google Arts and Culture move from an organization that basically digitized museum collections to an organization that's so dynamic and really does these extraordinary stories. So I really recommend it to you. Now, last but not at all least, we have my Georgetown colleague, Melisande Short Cologne. And Millie, I'm going to ask you something which is very unusual and not typical, which is for you not to speak. And we're going to introduce you first through a performance that Melly wrote. You're going to see part of the trailer for a performance that Melly wrote and was the solo performance in, called Here I Am. And it will give you a sense of her background, and then we'll hear your actual real voice. Thank you. I'm a little worried we're not getting the sound because there's beautiful music now. Yeah, we have to stop it. We're actually not getting the sound. Is anyone hearing me? So we're going to stop. Lama, can you hear that we're not getting the sound of Here I Am, which I will ask Millie to do it herself if we can't get that. And
Okay, let me try again. Sorry
okay.
about that.
That's okay. We'll get it. This is a very high-tech thing. We're getting somehow all the slides are being managed from London, so it's. Yeah, there's not sound here, but then it starts as soon as we see the Here I Am image. Yeah, perfect.
An American family story. I feel like my whole life and all of the lots that have come before me are balled up inside.
You know,
The New York Times broke a story in April 2016 revealing that the Jesuits had sold 272 enslaved persons in 1838 to raise funds to keep Georgetown University going. A few months later, I discovered that I descended from two families in the sale, the Queens and the Mahoneys. By September 2017, I had entered Georgetown College as an undergraduate student at the age of 63. Here I am, paying homage 11 generations of the women who have come into me and who are part of me. I am here to tell their story, handed down over more than 300 years. Our ancestors have waited patiently through centuries for us to come to the table of acknowledgement. I am Melisande Short Cologne. Here I am. Here we are.
and indeed. So that was an extraordinary performance that, as I said, Melly both wrote and performed in, that was performed against all odds in the midst of COVID and a high-tech feat of multiple different tech people working on it from different parts of the country. And the world. So Melly, maybe you can give us just a quick summary in your own voice of Here I Am, and then we'll come back to you when we're talking about slavery and a little bit about what you're doing now a couple of years later.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hi, everybody. My name is Melly Cologne. I wrote Here I Am. I met Cynthia and Herbert because of my relationship with Georgetown University. that started 5 years ago in 2017 when I went to Georgetown to complete my education. After the offer of, it's complicated. The Jesuits enslaved and sold my family from the 1700s through the Civil War. My family labored, and then they were trafficked, and all for the greater good of America and the edifice of Jesuit education across America. So 180 years later, students on campus at Georgetown were protesting in the light of, or in the wake of the Michael Brown killing, and a feeling on campus that the university and the administration was not being careful with the needs of Black students and students of color on campus. So they protested. They sat in the president's office, gave a list of demands. One of those demands was problems with living in dormitories and going to classes in buildings that were named after the men who brokered these human trafficking schemes. So the president brought together a working group. The working group did their work. There were recommendations. And 5 years later, we are here today working all of that out. It has taken 5 years of consistent work by students on campus, the administrators, professors, to offer students an opportunity to know more about their institution, and through the study of the institution's history with slaveholding and human trafficking, that they in turn learn something or know something better about America. I met Herbert because he was doing post-grad work at Georgetown when I first arrived there, and his study.
I'm going to stop you there because we're going to begin the last section with exactly that. So, yeah. So you're on the edge of your seats. What happened when they met, and why did they meet, and what was the connection? We will discover that. But now I want to take us back to the Malian Empire and ask Herbert to give us a sense of what Timbuktu and Mali, but we're going to kind of focus here on Timbuktu, where tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of scholars flocked from all over Africa, the Middle East, Europe, because it was such a center of learning and scholarship. Again, just like Florence, fueled by the funding from commerce. Give us a sense of what it was like in Mali and Timbuktu then in those days, and also introduce us to this person we're seeing on the screen, please.
So in my back there is something called the Catalan Atlas. It was created by a cartographer of the medieval period, Kreski Abraham, from what we believe was Andalusia, Spain. And he created, basically, they would consider that the known world. So this is one of 8 different pieces that are together, it's 8 portion slides. And this is number 2. It's a much larger this piece. And the original is at the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris in France, in Paris, France. That's where it's kept. And the individual you see there is a depiction of the Emperor Musa and Mansa as in the language of Mali, Mansa Musa the First. That's who you see in this picture with the golden orb in his hand. And he, people have reputed the richest man in the world. He, in many ways, placed Mali on the map of the world. He had this very famous Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, and the Catalan Atlas itself was created in 1375. So this is years later, but his fame is global, is international, and the atlas depicts, who's known, who's important, what particular parts of the world, what they're known for, what their importance is. And so this just, again, for us, a bit of evidence, expressing, showing us, demonstrating Mali's significance. The people who made this were not from Mali, they were in Europe, but they recognized and they were aware of that influence of what it represented. What I want to say, and what I really, in terms of talking about Mali, first of all, is that, so Mali's in West Africa. It's just basic sketching it out. And West Africa is large. Many people don't think about it. The United States can fit in West Africa. If you're going from Senegal to Cameroon, the United States literally fits from Morocco down to the coast. The United States fits in West Africa. That's how large it is. And the Mali Empire was one of 3 successive empires. It's the same people, basically, in that particular area. The Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Sungay Empire. They're successor empires. And they, for the most part, covered the expanse, the greater expanse of West Africa, the Niger River, which starts in today's Guinea and goes like an arc and ends out in Nigeria. The Senegal River, so that whole entire region is the scope and breadth of this empire. So you have to think about some place that's the size of the United States. Think about it that way, or almost the size of the United States. And Mansa Musa, Emperor Musa, is ruling that empire at its height. That's when the Mali Empire was the greatest, and its influence spread furthest. But the creator of the Mali Empire is Sunjata, who was the great king, the founder of that empire. Sunjata himself is a legend. In many ways, for an American audience, as a way to kind of make a quick connection, many people have remarked on the similarities of the Lion King, that we all know, with the Sundiata epic, right? And so it is in these ways that the history of Mali has come down, has come down, into popular consciousness in that way. Now, I'm saying all of that as well to say that these Savannah kingdoms, because that area is called the Savannah, sits right beneath the Sahara. It's the Sahel, and then the Savannah, like belts. The Savannah kingdoms were where these empires emerged. They're enmeshed in trading networks of salt, of gold, and even of humans. And over time, Trans-Sahara, etc., they stretch out, and Islam comes into that part of West Africa. And as it comes there, the people there, of course, are reacting and responding, and so they innovate. There's a lot of innovation in terms of statecraft, in terms of the institutions that get created in that part. And amongst the cities, especially along the Niger, Timbuktu is the one that will stand out as this jewel, but there's Gao, there's Djenné, there's a whole bunch of different cities that have ancient histories, medieval histories, and you could keep on going on to what's in current-day Nigeria, the Hausa cities of Sokoto and Kano and those places. So these cities go back to 1,000 years. And so it all represents, right, that sort of larger, deeper history. Now, we have this notion that Africa is this timeless place that never changed. But that's not true. I'm saying here that, politics, it's very complex. There are dynastic struggles, hierarchical societies or various classes in those societies. And indeed, in a place like Timbuktu, very literate societies, you have these aristocracies, you have the courts, the people in the royal courts, where they scheme and intrigue with each other. There are coups d'etats, there are wars that are fought, right, as what you would imagine would happen, in normal societies. So in many ways, yes, they do reflect and resemble, mirror, if you like, things that are taking place in China, in Persia, right, in Europe at that time. Yet this history is hidden in a way. The famous German philosopher of the 18th century, Friedrich Hegel, once remarked, Africa has no history. And in many ways, as you sort of said, so they're covering up this past, and for reasons that have to do with colonial conquest. And the French had this whole policy of what they call the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. And of course, if somebody is already civilized, why would you need a civilizing mission? And you can only really have a civilizing mission if they're not civilized. And that was always the rationale that, right, for doing this. And so Mali sort of would stand there, that knowledge of Mali as a rebuke, I guess, to that notion that this is a place of darkness. And Africa, of course, wasn't, and Mali's an example of that.
That is a perfect lead in. Thank you so much, Herbert. That is a perfect lead in to our really taking a deep dive now into the Mali Magic site and into the manuscripts themselves, which is they're there as a rebuke in a way to this idea. And the really exciting thing, and I hope some of you among there are or know, school teachers, because this, it's free, it's there, you can use this, and there are lesson plans on the site. So it's there for you to use in teaching African history. There's no excuse to say this doesn't exist anymore. Lama, why don't we, before I go on and on about the manuscripts and the subjects and stuff, let's look at the sizzle reel and just give a sense of what's on this incredibly rich site. Thank you so much, Lama. So you get a sense there of the 4 M's that the site is centered around: music, and it kills me that we can't talk more about music. I'm sure you all know that Malian music is the roots of blues and rock and roll, and the greats of American, European, anywhere music used to make a pilgrimage to the Festival of des Arts, which took place outside Timbuktu, and sadly hasn't been able to take place again since the occupation of 2012. So music, modern art, monuments. You can take a 3D tour of the Great Mosque of Djenné, which you saw there on the site, and of course, the manuscripts. And as Lama alluded, one of the reasons this is so important is that still to this day, sadly, 10 years later, Mali is still suffering the effects of this occupation. There's no, extremists are not in control of any of the cities and towns, but there is sporadic violence throughout the country, and sadly, tourism, which was so important, particularly for Timbuktu, but really for the whole country, tourism has not yet returned. So it's quite a desperate situation. Let's go, Lama, maybe you can take us through the section on the manuscripts. And when you look at this, just know that these manuscripts written from the 10th to the 20th century span an incredible range of topics, from astronomy, which we'll look at, medicine, different forms of scientific exploration. You can see there are all the subjects there. And very, kind of concrete ideas that are valuable today, and we'll look at those together. Did you want to add more, Lama, about the subjects and the different components of the site?
No, you can learn more about the stories and the characteristics of the manuscripts, and you can learn more about its history here as well, and zoom in. But we can start getting into the different stories.
Okay. So, but just know that these subjects are so contemporary, have such meaning for today. We'll start with the poems for peace, because that is really a huge preoccupation of Mali today, is trying to achieve peace. So why don't we dive into that one, Lama? And I'm emphasizing the value for today because Dr. Hydra, now in the third phase of his work with the manuscripts, is holding conferences and sessions around the country. So far it's been funded by the British Embassy, but I hope we'll receive more funding, taking passages from the manuscripts, introducing them to students, citizens, emphasizing that the wisdom that is needed for Mali to come out of its current challenges can be found in the writings of their ancestors. And that's a really important place to look for answers to today's problems. So Lama, tell us about this manuscript, please.
Thank you. So this, what we call the Poems of Peace, this manuscript is written by Omar Sidi Tallah, and it is written around his story where he learned about warring tribes and wanting to bring them together, trying to see what was the issue, and understanding it's very important to maintain and obtain peace for good governance. It is conditional for good governance. In his writings, he expresses how he was traveling and how he came across the different people in his journey, and how he was trying to see what is best to have peace between the tribes. And as speech would not do, it needs something more meaningful, inspired by a verse in the Quran that talks about if two tribes are fighting, work on bringing them together. He took this on, and in his writing, it was actually very interesting, personally, an interesting moment for me while I'm trying to read the manuscript up close, and reading through his words, how he's emotionally expressing the urgency in which he tried to work on a verse or a poem that is inspiring from each letter of that verse from the Quran, how to bring people together. So he wrote this big, huge poem, and he's writing it. And it's very emotional to read these manuscripts and to see how he's like, I was not even sitting, I was walking and traveling, very tired and very sick, but I needed to write this. And I don't see anything in front of me but sand. And it's the way it's written also, because these manuscripts at the time, there were no punctuation. So it's like an endless stream of thought directly from the author, writing about his experience, the emotions that he experienced when he was dealing, and people coming to him as an expert or as someone to bring them together. And it's very touching, and this is actually touches upon the importance of having and preserving the manuscripts in their original form, and not just understand the topics in which they discussed, because it really connects you with people from hundreds of years ago. And and having that kind of connection.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you who reads Arabic, who can, but it's not easy Arabic to read, but so who can
It is Old
penetrate
Arabic,
that.
yes.
Yeah, it's not easy to read. I mean, I don't read Arabic at all, but even for you, I know it was really hard to read, and it's so fantastic to get that flavor of the manuscript, you know. And I'm so pedantic. I'm always saying to Dr. Hydra, so what's the date and what does he say? And the dates are not especially important to him, and he would say, well, it's a story, you know, and this is what goes on in the story. And that's the way these really important points are made. Lama, I realize I kind of skipped over astronomy. Can we go back? Yeah. But there are amazing scientific manuscripts here. And again, I'm sorry, I used to be an art historian. I'm always kind of comparing to European things that we know, but it is pretty amazing. These are from the 15th century. So this is contemporary with Copernicus, 200 years before Galileo, talking about how the Earth circles the sun and showing an eclipse. So, you know, these is extraordinary knowledge in these manuscripts, and there are quite a number of them that have really beautiful illustrations like this. And I should say that it's thanks Google Arts and Culture digitized for the site 40,000 pages. And they sent a very high-level scanner to Bamako to really get the best possible images. Dr. Hydra, on his own, and with support from many, many partners, including the Hill Library here in the United States, a lot of European embassies. He has digitized, as I said, over 300,000 manuscripts. And it's really amazing. I've sat with him and seen him with his colleagues saying, oh, no, let's look at that one. And they can just pull it up, you know, out of the 300,000. And I'm happy to say one of the results of his going around the country talking about it is there are many, many more students coming to work on the manuscripts, which is really great. What is unfortunately not so great, and where he needs help now with Savama, is there's no library for them to go to. In Timbuktu, in the heyday of tourism in Timbuktu, there were multiple different libraries belonging to the different families, and tourists would go and see the manuscripts. In Bamako, Dr. Hydra doesn't have a formal visiting space. Just has like one room in his headquarters. So that's a really acute need now as the interest in the manuscripts increases. We need a place where people can go, because sadly, you know, I think for a number of years people thought, oh, well, they'll all go back to Timbuktu soon. But unfortunately, the situation remains unstable enough that we just don't know when exactly it'll be safe to go back to Timbuktu. Lama, let's turn now to the manuscript by Ahmed Baba. You explain what this crazy thing is that you guys have done.
No, I was just showing it while you're talking about how being able to access the manuscripts and reading them up close. And then here you can see the amount of digitized manuscripts floating in a universe of verse and reading them up close.
So they have each one of the 40,000 pages, and they do amazing things with them. And then you can also look at them up close. And I should say on the site, there is an explanation of each of the texts. And also a colleague of mine from Georgetown, Professor Joanne Moran Cruz, has written a very short essay on sort of comparing what's in these manuscripts with what was going on in other parts of the world, the Arab world and Europe. So the last manuscript that I want to look at with you is one by Ahmed Baba, the most renowned scholar from Timbuktu, who worked in the late 16th, early 17th century. And he's particularly known for this tract on slavery. So this is going to take us into our next discussion. And Ahmed Baba, on the one hand, it said something that was, you know, relatively new for the time, which was he insisted that not all black Africans should be considered as slaves, or even they could be slaves. That he wasn't, I'm afraid, against slavery altogether, but slavery was something not for black Africans, but for non-Muslims. and Muslims should not enslave other Muslims. But I want you to tell us, Lama, about the writing and some of the phrases, because what's interesting, again, we were talking with Dr. Hydra the other day, and I said, but what does he really say about it? And it's complex. He goes back and forth. He says a lot of different things, and give us a sense of that.
Yes, he's saying a lot of things and going back and forth, and he's writing, and you can read up and see that people are coming to him, consulting him about this topic that was very difficult, of course, also at the time, and people are wanting his advice and his opinion, and he's writing all that people come to me and they ask me, and in his opinion is that all people are equal, but he doesn't know how to always say that to people, or that's what the impression is, and he keeps repeating this verse from the Quran, "We are gods and to him we return." And upon further discussion with Dr. Hydra, I asked, why is this phrase repeated? And he explains, he was in pain. This was something very difficult, very sensitive. And when he saw people being enslaved and he couldn't do much about it, he would say, "We are gods and to him we return," because of feeling helpless, feeling pained at the topic. And this kind of another emotional connection with the author, writing directly about what happened, his thoughts, how he experienced these kind of subjects and people coming to him for advice. This is a very controversial, difficult topic, but you can still see the author's emotions through it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So that gives you a sense of the richness of this site, but you can go to that library and, click on the book of whatever subject interests you and learn about it. Thank you so much, Lama. But you're sticking around because I'm sure people probably have questions for you. So we're coming back to you guys. So they left you at the edge of your seats. When we first met, how did you first meet at Georgetown? What brought you together? And what was the connection?
Herbert and I met. I was going to Georgetown as a descendant of families who were enslaved and trafficked by the Jesuits. And Herbert was doing research into the founding family of Georgetown and the Maryland colony, the Carrolls. And our relationship and friendship grew around his research into the Margaret, the Carroll family, their slaveholding in Maryland, and the reality that my family was enslaved by the Carrolls.
So there's a man called James Carroll, who at one point is, of course, one of the wealthiest persons in the what becomes the United States. It was colonial. This is the 1700s. And James Carroll had come from Ireland, actually. His uncle had sponsored him here, his uncle, Charles Carroll, a very wealthy man himself. But James comes over, and James accumulates a lot of money and wealth and power. A big landowner. In fact, he was the largest landowner in Maryland. And in Maryland, to make money, you went into tobacco. And so he owns tobacco plantations. For your tobacco to make money, you need labor, and his labor force was brought in from Africa. So James Carroll was both a plantation owner, but he was also a slave trader. And so he had connections around the Atlantic. And there was a particular ship called the Margaret, which in 1718 left London, went to West Africa, Sierra Leone, a place called Buns Island, and there a group of people enslaved, captured, enslaved, were brought to Annapolis, Maryland. And James Carroll was like the organizer of this enterprise that I just mentioned to you. And he's a very meticulous businessman. He has his account book, or the day book it was called. And when the shipment came in, he lists everybody who was brought over. and how many days it took to sell them, how much was paid, who bought them, and he's breaking it down meticulously, how many men, how many women, how many children, and he's got this list. His day book sits in the archive at Georgetown University, and it was this day book that I was looking at, the actual book itself that was there. There's much else because he kept records, and Melly-san will talk about what she also discovered later in that particular day book. And just going through that, I wrote something about Carroll and the Carroll family. When James Carroll died, he had no children, he was never married, and he conveyed his entire estate to the Jesuits. He was a devout Catholic, and so he turned over all of that land and the people he owned to the Jesuits. And this is the 1730s when he's died. And of course, the Jesuits, this money is what helped the Jesuits finance their pursuits, their endeavors, creating educational institutions, including Georgetown, around the country, around the United States. But that's the basic story of James Carroll. His first cousin, once removed, John Carroll, was the founder of Georgetown, Bishop John Carroll.
I'm going to, Millie, I want you to tell your family story. I just want to underscore, just so you understand, so we are talking about a religious order that is receiving funds from enslaved people, and the religious order then uses those funds to found, our university, Georgetown University, one of the premier universities of the United States. So coming back to what you said, Herbert, about how slavery was so fundamental to the United States, our university, we can say, is literally built on the backs of slaves.
Right. We can say that slavery was fundamental, but slavery was not a given in colonial America. James Carroll kept his day books. He kept his meticulous records. In 1718, he wrote about his Negroes who arrived on the Margaret, a ship that he built. In 1715, he wrote, and I saw it in his 1715 day book, about the purchase of the indenture of my 11 times great-grandmother, who arrived in the Maryland colony after spending, she was born in Ecuador, went to England in 1711, was there until 1714, came to Maryland as a redemptorist. And a redemptorist were people who did not have their indenture secured when they left, or the ship. Nobody had their indenture. So Queen Mary arrived here in 1715. She lived in Maryland, Annapolis or somewhere, for several weeks, and her indenture was purchased, he wrote it in his book, by James Carroll. He paid 35 pounds to Thomas Larkin, who was the person that Mary Queen came with, and he paid 35 pounds for her. Those 35 pounds were 35 pounds of tobacco, because that was the currency of the Maryland colony. And that 35 pounds in Maryland would go to Europe, to England, and then it would be turned into silver. So that was one side of my family's beginning, 1715. My other grandmother arrived here in 1677 with the Calvert family. So because of changing notions and laws in the colonies, these women who had come to the colony as free women, but indentured servants because of the color of their skin. At the end of their indenture, they were criminalized. They both had children. They were criminalized. Their children were criminalized. They were incarcerated, and Joyce stayed in a cellar for 7 or 8 months, and when she came out, she and her children were incarcerated and made slaves for life. So the notion that slavery was a permanent or there were dedicated laws, the people who were most invested in the institution of slavery and the schemes of American human trafficking were the people who made the laws to support the institution, because they were the people who had power. They were the white men who had power, and the Jesuits are then and still remain one of the most powerful institutions in the United States and the world.
Just to put a little sort of point on that, another illustration of in terms of how this stuff evolves over time, because it is an evolving system. When the Maryland colony is being set up, the laws of slavery, because the laws of slavery did not happen in 1632 when the colony was initially set up. It actually happened over a few decades, and folks are responding. Individuals are attempting to consolidate their power, and they're changing the laws. So the first time slavery passed through the male, right? And then they changed it, and they changed the laws, and they said no, slavery is going to pass through the female, because of course when they started saying slavery is passing through the male, there were women who said no, he's not the father. Somebody else is the father. Cases in court, about that, where people would go there, to sue for their freedom, saying no, that man. And of course, they didn't have DNA in those days, and so they changed it. And I'm just giving you guys this illustration to let you know that system, that these are like willful people calculating, as they create these particular types of institutions.
Wait, okay.
And yeah, to sort of piggyback on what Herbert said, in our narrative about the creation of slavery in America, we don't identify that the institution of slavery was not created on the backs of black men. It was created in the wombs of black women, because every child that was born from an enslaved black woman was born to be a slave for life. Who does that?
No.
Nobody had ever done that. Not in any ancient history in the world. Nobody had made a baby at birth a slave. What kind of people do that? And yet, they were Christians.
I'm going to just interrupt with a housekeeping thing, and then I'm going to come back to one more question for both of you. You have all received cards, and you're most welcome to write down your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. I want to just ask one more question of each of you. The title of this is it mentions uncomfortable truths that can be found in manuscripts. We've talked about how this rich, vivid history of Africa is an uncomfortable truth to people who don't want to think that Africa has a written history. Melly, you yourself are one of thousands of uncomfortable truths for Georgetown, because Georgetown University, this history that we're talking about, specifically the sale of, we know now, 300 plus enslaved people in 1838, and a critical juncture where Georgetown was basically bankrupt. And in order to raise the funds to keep the university going, the two Jesuits running it sold, because they were in Maryland, they had slaves, sold 300 plus enslaved people to raise the money. They were all sent to Louisiana. And the story of the university was that they all died. Now, these are people who survived the Atlantic Passage and slavery, and we're supposed to believe that Louisiana killed all of them. Well, that is a lot easier, as you can see, because when you have people like Melly, you're not going to get away with much. So I want you, please, Melly, just tell a little bit about the finding out that you were a descendant, and then maybe a little something about what Georgetown is doing. A lot, because she's there on campus every day, so they can't get away with doing nothing.
I found out, well, I knew that I was a descendant of people who had been enslaved in Maryland. My grandmother was born into a family of old people who had been children in the 1838 sale, because more than 3/4 of the people who were sold in 1838 were under the age of 18. Louisiana had a law on the books that no child under the age of 12 could be sold to Louisiana without a mother. So the Jesuits said they were keeping families together, when in fact it was the law on the receiving end of these enslaved people that no, you can't do that. Georgetown was the golden child of the Society of Jesus that was created by the labor of enslaved people. Those funds were compiled, they were saved, they were 50 years of enslaved labor was saved to purchase the land, and then 100 some years later, they sold those same families. So it was an economic system. One of the things I said on campus when I arrived, there were some issues on campus that needed to be repaired. And I was like, oh, if y'all had some people to sell, you could get that money right quick, but we don't do that no more, do we? So Georgetown is doing what Georgetown can do as an institution of higher learning on campus, and that is to make this history part of the culture of the campus for students. The Society of Jesus is another story. And the Society of Jesus and Georgetown College and University should not be conflagrated into being the same, because they are different. Georgetown, the president of Georgetown, the administration, some of the faculty and students have done the work over 5 years to say, we're not there, we're here now. The Jesuits, not so much.
I should say one of the things Georgetown has done is to make Melly an employee of Georgetown, and she is the Community Engagement Associate for the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, which I co-direct, and she continues to work on Here I Am. I'm not giving you a link because you have to stay tuned, because it's going to be coming around in a live plus video performance. I can start taking some of the questions, but first, Herbert, I wanted to ask you to maybe pick up, and if this isn't the question you want to answer, just answer the question you would like to answer, but I did want to ask you to pick up on what Melly was telling us about some of the different aspects of slavery in America. And because we heard from Ahmed Baba, it existed all over the world. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the transformation of slavery in the United States?
Sure, and that's really the word transformation. When we think about slavery, we think about it as fixed, as something that is, that has no fluidity, that from day one, 1619, people stepped off the boat in, Hampton, and bang, that was it. Always that way. But that's not how that's not how it was. History, slavery has not only changed. It did not only change over time, but it varied from place to place. So slavery in Boston, and there was slavery in Boston, it's very different from slavery in New Orleans, right? And what do I mean? I mean that, for example, most African Americans who lived in Boston, although there was slavery there, were free, actually, right? If you went to Boston. In a place like New Orleans as well, although most people were enslaved, there's a large free black population. And if you went to a state like Maryland, although it was a slave state and it was a slave society, the city of Baltimore was quite different. So people like Frederick Douglass, when he ran away from the plantation in the Eastern Shore, went to Baltimore, a place where he could hide. The fugitives are in Baltimore because they can hide. They can run to Baltimore. Although the surrounding areas, you have these plantations. And if you read the newspapers of that day, you see all these, wanted ads. Somebody ran away. And they will say, we think he ran to Baltimore. We think she ran to Baltimore. They have family there. You would sort of see that. So again, there's this variation that exists. And sometimes it's tied to the economy, tobacco versus rice versus cotton. And those staple crops emerge at different times. During most of America's history, tobacco really is a crop, not cotton, although we all think about cotton when we think about slavery. But cotton emerges after independence in the 19th century, that sort of thing. So for the bulk of the history, it's the economies where tobacco is grown, and tobacco has specific types of structures that are different from cotton. They're not big plantations, that sort of thing. Again, we think about Gone with the Wind, Tara, and Magnolia and the Trees, right? But it's that variation. Let's go slightly more beyond that. The Atlantic system is a system that starts in the Mediterranean and gradually moves out into the Atlantic. That sugar is the thing that drives it for most of its history, from the islands off the coast of Portugal to islands off the coast of West Africa, not West Africa itself, but the islands off the coast, Cape Verde and those places, into Brazil, and then into Suriname, and into the Caribbean, and finally into North America. That's the history of slavery. And it changed as it went along. And the Dutch come in, and the English come in, and the French come in, even though the Portuguese had started it. So there's an entire transformation. As Nelly talked about, this business about transformation from generation to generation, intergenerational, that's kind of new. The racial part of it, tying slavery to race, is also new. So although slavery existed in ancient Rome and ancient Mali, when it comes to the Americas, is a different kettle of fish that had emerged. And of course, during the question and answer, we can talk a little bit more about that transformation.
I'm going to pick up on a later period of that, and I will try to get to all the questions. Forgive me if I don't. There's a question about the period of time. It's about Maryland, when Maryland, importing enslaved people was outlawed, and Maryland switched to a free state.
No, Maryland is never.
It isn't a free.
Yeah, Maryland is never a free state.
No, sorry. Switched to. Sorry, it's hard to read the word. Switch. Breeding slaves.
Oh, the question of breeding. I'm not, so as a historian of slavery, the framing of that issue, and that even that term itself, breeding, is it's very problematic.
Right.
And I know that there are lots of folks who've talked about it, you know. And if you go back to, there's no novel Mandingo, and the boxer Ken, yeah, he acted, you know, and that's mythology. Most of that is mythology. What is true, what is a fact, is that towards the end of the 18th century, the United States, because we got the records, right? Slavevoyages.org. Go look at it. It's a great source, data, just on slave ships, just because it's a business, so they keep a lot of records. The importation of Africans declines drastically declines. And what that suggests to us, anybody who's seriously studying this, is that there's a natural increase in the population. A natural increase in the population starts to happen. And it's not because the plantation owners of the United States are like nice liberals who want to improve the lifetimes. It's because they cannot compete, actually, with their Caribbean counterparts who are really making money, but the Caribbean is kind of like a death camp. And so what has happened in this competition is a global market, right? What has happened in this competition is that in the Caribbean, to put it short, you can bring somebody in, you pay more money, they die, you go back and send and bring more people in. The North American plantation owners are not as large and don't have as much money, and so they have to figure out, and they start to do this. They start to figure out that, let's, for example, like you talked about Louisiana, where they said, if you don't have that parent, that particular age, don't bring that child here. A woman is pregnant, let's give her a little bit more time. She doesn't have to go out there and work. And they figure that out, that it will increase the probability of her child living, right? Not because the plantation owner is a nice guy, but it's his investment. That's how he's making his money. He wants them to live. He doesn't want to have to go and pay money in the international market to bring people in. And so I have people here, let the child survive. So birth rates increase as opposed to the past. So birth rates increase, is what I'm saying. Mortality rates decline because they're actually making changes, specific sorts of changes, to give them benefits, and that benefit comes in from having more. In Maryland,
I have to go to.
Okay.
We can maybe come back to that, but we're running a little short of time. The same person asked if James Carroll wrote the names of the slaves, and yes, he did, and that's how Billy saw her relatives.
So some names he wrote. Billy's ancestor. But from that ship, Margaret, he didn't write the names. He only wrote everything about them. Actually, you can say that he transformed them from having names to just being Negroes. That's what he put there, right? Negroes. And he made, quote unquote, he made them Negroes. He racialized them, if you think about that. But he wrote the names of the people he sold them to. And what I guess a great sort of project would be how to trace those people. Like go find out from the purchasers, who did they buy, and you might find information and might be able to trace that way.
And there is a huge mythology in the United States that we have all sort of ascribed to until very recently, and that was, we'll never know who the enslaved people were because nobody wrote their names down. When in fact, that's actually not true. Nobody has looked for the names of those people and have gone along with the prevailing narrative that we just don't know who they were, when that is in fact not true. Case in point, the GU-272,
which are the descendants of the Georgetown, the enslaved people sold for Georgetown.
The names of those actually 314 people, because there were women who were pregnant, there were babies who were unnamed, there were people who were traded out for other people. When Richard Cellini, who founded the Georgetown Memory Project, was told, we don't know who those people were, he took the names that were on the manifest of the ship, where families, entire family names were written down, and he brought those family names through time forward. Genealogy is like looking back, but genealogy can also bring people forward in time. So for people who were relegated to they all died and we'll never know who their descendants are, 6 years after Richard looked for person one as a descendant, the Georgetown Memory Project has identified 11,600 descendants from those 314 people.
And I just want to say this man, Richard Cellini, is not a professor or student of slavery. I mean, this is a random Georgetown alumnus who, when this story broke and he read they all died, just said to himself, that just seems really unlikely, and set to work.
Well, he did
tried to
not
see-
accept what he was told because it didn't make sense.
But that just happened 6 years ago. This has been
6
going
years
on
ago.
for decades, 100 years. No
And-
one said that.
6 years later, what was supposed to be a story about Georgetown and what Georgetown was doing then became a story about descendants of those families who were enslaved. And now we have institutions all over America, including Harvard, who are not only acknowledging but are actively participating in correcting the wrongs they made. And that was teaching the people to go out and make bad laws to enslave and disenfranchise other people.
I want to end, and I guess Cora's going to come with a few words. I want to end, thank you so much, both of you, just coming back to the manuscripts. One person asked if it ever becomes possible to go to Mali, can I go see the manuscripts? First of all, it's very possible to go to Mali. I actually recommend it. I've gone once or twice a year for the last 7 years, and I really recommend the capital, Bamako. At the moment, I have to honestly say, but I'm going to point out my friend Mohammed Hamalik here. Would you like to stand up, Mohammed? Who is here, fortunately, tonight from Bamako and originally from Timbuktu. I would encourage you to go see him after the program. He can give you a sense of the situation. He was the fixer guide for the film, The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, so he knows everything inside out. So I don't want to say, oh, it's totally fine, go, don't give it a thought. No, Timbuktu's a little dangerous, but people go to Bamako. They're fantastic places to stay. Do not stay in an international hotel. Stay at my favorite hotel, the Badla, or another one like that. And it's a fantastic city. So, Mohammed, you stay there so people can come talk to you if they want to go. So, yes, it's possible. And yes, Dr. Hydra would be thrilled to have you come look at the manuscript. I have to honestly say, I don't think you're going to be able to understand anything. But I'm sorry, but find someone who speaks Arabic, find someone who speaks something, and try. They're definitely worth it. Or you arrange it in advance. Contact me. I'll give you my contact. We'll figure out some way for someone to explain them to you. We love to have people come to Mali and come look at the manuscript. So definitely do it. Someone else asked, is there anything that has come out of the manuscripts that changes what was preconceived history? Lama, I'm going to ask if you have an answer to that. I'm going to say something. I unfortunately don't know enough about African history to say whether some discussion of a war between somebody and somebody changes things that were thought. I will say something that adds a lot to knowledge in a more specific way. The writings on good governance and leadership are quite extraordinary, and again, very relevant to today. They say specifically, do not accept gifts from anyone. Do not trust the advice of someone who gives you gifts. And that the role of the leader is to be the servant of the people, to serve the people he's leading. It's quite an extraordinary concept, you know, for basically the Renaissance period. And that leader owes everything to the people and should never accept any kind of gifts or bribes. And I just think this is written around the same time as Machiavelli's Prince, which has really different kind of advice, you know, figure out a way to stay ahead no matter what, do what it takes to stay in power, and maybe once you're there you should think about the people, but basically it's a prescription on how to stay in power. And that's not what these manuscripts that I've seen say. They really talk about the responsibility of a leader to his or her people. Did you want to add anything to that, Lama? There's something that's come out of the manuscripts that changes ideas we had before.
I think it mainly changes our ideas we have of people at the time. The different topics discussed, the openness in which they discussed the sciences and human affairs, and the kind of open Islam that was very contradictory to the Puritans that came in 2012 trying to destroy it. So it is that it's a change of ideas more than new content.
Thank you, thank you. I am going to conclude with a quote from Dr. Hydra, but I think I could also substitute in this quote for the word searchlights, for the words manuscripts, I could substitute also Herbert Brewer and Melly Cologne. So the quote from Dr. Hydra is, "In the dark night of our present existence, manuscripts are the searchlights that probe our past." And you two are also searchlights that probe our past. And thank you very, very much.
Wow. Thank you for taking us around the world and back, and bringing it very close to home and close to the bone even. I just want to mention, thank you all for coming and experiencing this rich conversation. We have a couple more programs that we'd love to see you at again around the Mali Magic program series. The first I'll mention is going to be on October 27th. We will be joined by Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky. Yes, it's called Bamako to Brooklyn. And Yakuba Sissoko, who is a Jele and a master kora player. He will also be back on November 13th to play music. So please come and join us on this stage then. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Lama.